I'd
Hi,
like
guys.
to, hi, Tom. Just a short introduction. I'd like to welcome Dr. Tom Duthy, Executive Director of Invex Therapeutics. Invex Therapeutics is an ASX-listed clinical stage biopharmaceutical company focused on the development of exenatide as a treatment for neurological conditions arising or involving increased intracranial pressure. That's a mouthful. The company has just commenced phase 3 trials of the drug in patients with idiopathic intracranial hypertension. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tom to take us through the presentation. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rosemary. Apologies if there's a bit of nascent background noise here. I'm actually calling from or dialing in from the airport, which is unavoidable. Quite spot. So hopefully you can hear me.
Was your flight actually scheduled for 7 o'clock this morning, but you're still at the airport waiting? The rest hasn't been going through.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I'll thank you, Chris, for the kind introduction. I'll just get through as we go. Just one moment. It's our standard disclaimer. So as Chris mentioned, we are explicitly focused on a single phase 3 clinical trial in idiopathic intracranial hypertension, IH. We have orphan drug designation in both the United States and Europe. We are addressing a $1.6 billion total addressable market across both the US, Europe, and the UK. And really, I guess an investment in Invex Therapeutics is really predicated on the success of that trial. So I would draw your attention to the capital structure on the bottom left. We have a balance sheet that is exceptionally well managed in my view. We have 27.3 million in cash as at 30 September. We have a very low enterprise value relative to the market opportunity. And as I'll come to in a few moments, we are very focused on executing our phase 3 program for registration of our drug, which is a sustained release formulation of a repurposed agent called exenatide, and we trademarked that as Crescendon. Our share structure is located there on the right. Our directors, I'm sure you all know and are familiar with Megan Baldwin as well, who's the current CEO of Opthea. So really, for us, these are the sort of the three main snapshots that I'd like to impart on the listeners and the audience today. Is that basically we're treating a disease or a disorder that has it's very well known mechanistically. So idiopathic intracranial hypertension is a disorder of excess production of cerebral spinal fluid or CSF, and that leads to high intracranial or brain pressure. And the result of that pressure is very severe and debilitating headache, and also in up to 25% of patients, if left untreated, it leads to permanent vision loss. So it's a compression of the optic nerve driven by that high pressure in the brain. And so for us, I mean, the impact is quite profound here. So why is it an orphan indication? Well, it's an orphan indication because it's rare, albeit the incidence of the indication is growing, commensurate with obesity. So there's a correlation to weight in this disorder. It affects 90% of patients or more are female of childbearing age. But really, the economics here are really interesting. So yes, it's rare, but it's very expensive to treat. So there are no approved drug treatments. So we, if successful, will be the first approved drug therapy for IH. But the cost on the healthcare system is actually quite high here, and I'll come to this in a moment. But one of my co-directors, Alex Sinclair, has actually modelled that in the UK. And the costs are huge relative to the incidence of the disorder. The science, I would say, is first class. So Professor Sinclair is a leading expert in IAH. She's a co-founder of the company, and she was the first to generate the necessary clinical and scientific data to support the fact that exenatide helps to lower intracranial pressure. And so we have a very sound scientific basis from which we've derived these clinical trials and prosecuting them through to completion. The market dynamics I've mentioned, so again, a large addressable market. I quite often get asked about this a lot. Is that number too small? Well, in essence, it's not a cancer market where there's tens of billions of addressable market. But what I would say there is it's not confounded by multiple drug therapies and different treatment regimens. This is completely unencumbered. So from the perspective of a first-line drug therapy, I'd much rather that kind of market dynamic than trying to compete against 20 other oncology drugs in, for example, colorectal cancer or other. We now have the clinical data that we reported phase 2 data in May of 2020. We've moved very rapidly to a phase 3 pivotal trial that supports registration in the EU, UK, and Australia. And as I mentioned from the start, we also have very high barriers to entry. So an orphan drug designation, as John mentioned previously, that confers effectively a regulatory encumbrance against anyone trying to enter your market with much the same drug. And so that's 7 years in the US and 10 years in Europe. And we also have issued patents for our repurposed exenatide in IAH. So really nice barriers, and that's as expected. You would want to see that in a biotechnology company. The addressable market, I just wanted to kind of draw your attention here to how we generate the annual addressable market and how we think about the patient dynamics here. So this is not a once and done treatment. These patients, basically, if you withdraw therapy, they will relapse. And so this is a chronically administered once per week subcutaneous treatment for IAH patients. And so because of that, albeit the incidence is low and the number of patients on the left-hand side is low, the actual market opportunity is quite large as a chronically administered therapeutic agent. The drivers to this market, as I mentioned, are obesity. So it's actually growing at over 3% a year in terms of the incidence data. There's also, as treatment guidelines have been developed and diagnostic criteria developed since 2018, there's actually more awareness and there's more diagnoses. So diagnoses, obviously, for a developer like ourselves, the more patients who are diagnosed, the more patients we can technically treat, and therefore, over time, that would increase our TAM. Here's the data on the economic cost. So, one of the things that was very paramount or very obvious to me this morning was seeing that CSL have priced a haemophilia therapy at $3.5 million. It's a once and done. But in isolation, so that's a very expensive drug. But relative to the economic cost of the patient, it's actually cost bearing and cost effective. In CSL's case, that's $20 million for a haemophilic patient. So for us, with that in mind, we have an ability here to be cost bearing because if we administer this treatment, we are keeping patients out of hospital. We're keeping patients from invasive neurosurgical procedures to lower pressure. And for us, that's a really important metric and confers not only sort of pricing power, as it were, but also it's most likely going to be a very cost-effective and economic intervention for patients and the taxpayer more broadly. There's definitely a need to develop new treatments for IAH. So on the right-hand side here, this is National Health Service data from the UK. Basically, these patients are currently over 90% are managed through off-label treatments that, as I mentioned, are not approved. There's some anecdotal evidence that they may be useful, but suffice to say that is our opportunity. The one drug that is used off-label is a drug called acetazolamide. About 50% of patients can't tolerate it and drop off. So there's really this urgent need for a new intervention. And for us, it is about improving these patients' quality of life, which is manifested by debilitating headache. So if we can lower headache and therefore improve vision, that's the key metric of our intervention. For any biotech company, I sort of put this chart up to highlight, you need to sort of check us against what we're doing with the development of our drug. And it's important to have both manufacturing, a clinical trial pathway, regulatory sign-off, and also funding. So I feel pretty confident today that we've checked all of these boxes. The one box that's sort of slightly checked is the phase 3 program. So we've commenced recruitment. We haven't recorded that trial, but from a manufacturing perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and from a funding perspective, we're in very good shape. So just looking at our manufacturing, we partnered with a Korean company called Peptron in September of 2021. For us, that was time sparing and cost sparing. So we were originally going to reformulate exenatide ourselves to a once a week formulation, but in lieu of that internal development, we have partnered with Peptron, who can manufacture 12,000 patient treatments per month, which is essentially half the incidence market in the European Union and the UK. And that transaction for us is economically fantastic. We pay a fixed price, whether we buy 1 unit or 1 million units from Peptron. There are no royalties, there are no milestone payments tied to sales. So it's a very simple agreement. However, for us, it also gives us absolute certainty on our cost of goods. So we're very fortunate to be working with Petron. This is the phase 3 program, and I don't want to bore the listeners with the minutiae of how we prosecute this trial. This trial has been exceedingly well designed with the very best minds having input into its design. And so what we're looking to do here is to recruit 240 patients across 40 sites in both Europe, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, and the United States. And the primary endpoint here is a mechanistic endpoint, is does Presendin lower intracranial pressure? We hope it will, of course. Our phase 2 data supported that thesis. And the secondary endpoints, you can see there are those sort of clinical outcomes that are important to regulators and naturally the patients. And that is, can we change vision, which is parametric mean deviation, swelling, and also headache days. And again, as I mentioned, our phase 2 data was supportive that it can do all three. And that's why with confidence we've raised the necessary capital to move us into phase 3. This is just a snapshot of the global nature of the trial. So we have our manufacturer, and we have our clinical sites dispersed globally, and we also have in place a trial steering committee, which consists of the very best minds in IAH. They tend to be, on the most part, neuro-ophthalmologists, so that's a subspecialty that treats neurological disorders of the eye, and they're effectively our users, if you like. The snapshot here from a regulatory perspective, very, very important to get the regulatory regimen correct. And we spent a lot of time on ensuring that we could deliver to shareholders the very best trial design. And so we worked with the US Food and Drug Administration, the European Medicines Agency throughout 2021 and into 2022. And importantly for us, we now are at the stage where we have treated and randomized our first patient into the IAH phase 3 trial, which is a fantastic milestone for us. The reason this was important, probably lost to some extent for some, but this is the most efficient and cost-effective means by which we can deliver a clinical outcome. And we did attempt to harmonise both the US Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency. Unfortunately, from our perspective, we have a registration-directed trial for Europe, UK, Australia. With the Food and Drug Administration, we will take our data to them, and we will determine what are our next steps to support a market registration in the United States. But having said that, we are enrolling patients in the US under an IND. So these are our milestones. I'm pleased to report that we've delivered most of them so far this quarter. We have a couple of regulatory filings pending in both Israel and Europe. Probably the most important one here is on the 25th of November. On the 21st of November, we recruited our first patient. So in summary, our whole expenditure and moving forward for us is dedicated to Presendin in IAH Evolve phase 3, and it will support registration in those markets. So those 3 markets are 1 billion of the 1.6 total addressable market, billion addressable market. So that's a pretty good market opportunity for us, given it's completely unencumbered. We do feel that if we are approved, that we will be rapidly incorporated into the consensus treatment guidelines. They were co-authored by our executive director, Alex Sinclair, who is the world's expert in IAH. And that's important from a clinical perspective to garner utilization. We also are looking at the economics. As I mentioned today with CSL, it is important in this day and age to show that there's an economic return to the taxpayer through the approval and payment of new drug therapies. So again, we collect data on that basis. But this could be, if successful, the world's first approved drug therapy for IAH in any jurisdiction, and we're very committed to getting there over the next couple of years. From a financial perspective, well funded, and as I mentioned at the start, we dedicate all of our financial resources to prosecution of the clinical trials. So the underlying burn, if you like, ex-R&D of the company is $1 million per annum. So with that, I'll turn back to Chris, and thanks everyone for your attention.
Thanks, Tom. We'll just check for questions online. while we wait to those, I'll ask the first one. Obviously, IIH is an obvious target given Professor Sinclair's expertise and from a commercial sense pricing, but obviously intracranial pressure or increased raised intracranial pressure is a feature of multiple indications. Could you perhaps just elaborate on where the next one could come from in terms of an indication?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So we, as I mentioned, we've dedicated all of our resources today to IIH. So we're now at a stage where the phase 3 has commenced and that will run its process in due course. However, as you rightly say, elevated intracranial pressure is manifests across a number of disorders. So there is traumatic brain injury, for example, stroke, and then a neurological disorder called hydrocephalus, and also types of meningitis. So as a company, we've been working behind the scenes, if you like, or in the background to determine what is the logical next indication for Crescendon, our once-a-week formulation, and we certainly are committed to initiating new trials over time, but we're not at a stage yet to have formally selected which indication that may be.
And having met Professor Sinclair last week, I was fascinated to hear about her involvement with NASA and how this condition is a problem of space travel and how she is working with NASA on potential clinical trials in that space.
Yeah, she's received, I mean, I can't speak for Alex, obviously, but she has received funding for that, and that's separate and distinct from Invex. What I would say is that mechanistically with Crescendon, it's very straightforward and simple. But this targets GLP-1, and that lowers CSF secretion, and that's important, funnily enough, for astronauts to see elevated ICP over time if they're in a zero gravity environment. So obviously, from a market perspective, impossibly small, but interesting scientifically nonetheless.
And huge endorsement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably understated to some extent the quality of the people here at Invex, and Alex is in every respect the leading light in IIH, and so we're very fortunate to have her engage with her scientific and medical peers to help us with our phase 3 trial. That is absolutely critical in terms of prosecuting and recruiting patients. And she's, as I mentioned, she's a co-author of those treatment guidelines, and that becomes important for us if we are ultimately successful with our phase 3 and we get a registered drug.
I was just going to circle back to that. Obviously, her standing in the community speeds up path to market, subject to approval. Absolutely. And that's the beauty of having an unencumbered opportunity here. We're not dilly-dallying around 20 different standards of care. There is no drug standard of care, so it would very neatly slot into a first-line regimen if we are successful. And I particularly like that as a market opportunity for us. Definitely. And in terms of next milestones, what should we be looking for? Yeah, so we've got those pending regulatory clearances both in Europe and Israel in the very short term period. But really for now, and I'll just pair back to the slide, really for us now, it's about the execution of our clinical trial. So I would say that 2023 is an exciting time for us as we set up new centres. So we expect our US sites to be up and running shortly. And then I guess progressively, it's a 2-year recruitment, which it sounds like a long time. And unfortunately, it is what it is. We would love to beat that guidance that we've given. And so I guess watch this space for how our recruitment is going in 2023. But I think relative to the enterprise value and the fact we're funded through to commercialisation, I think we're in a very good position at the moment. Especially given your low cash burn and great financial position. Absolutely. Yeah. Great. Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for that presentation. Thanks, Tom.